All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is the Behind the CV and Growing Up in Science event. Growing Up in Science was started at NYU by Professor Wei-Ji Ma several years ago, and the general format of this talk is for a professor, like our professor here, to talk about their path and their journey growing up in science, what they have dealt with, different decision points, and generally building up to where they are today. And today I would like to introduce Professor Michael Platt. He is a professor of psychology, neuroscience, and marketing. Is that right?
Professor of Neuroscience in the School of Medicine, Psychology in the College, and Marketing at Wharton. Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Exactly. Yep. And he's doing a great job at introducing himself already, and I will continue to let him take it away.
I've memorized my appointments.
All right, and without further ado, and feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. This is a talk, but also kind of like a conversation. So without further ado, I hand it over to Michael.
Okay, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for showing up. And I know some of you will be late for a party, so that means a lot to me. Honestly, if you want to poke me a little further on anything, raise your hand and ask me a question, because it's hard to know exactly what level of detail and depth to go into this story at any point. So from the time I was a young boy, I knew I wanted to work at the intersection of neuroscience, psychology, and business. And so I set myself on that path. I'm just joking. So there's absolutely nothing linear about my path to where I am today. And actually I have no bona fide credentials in any of the three disciplines in which I currently have appointments. So my undergraduate degree is in anthropology, my graduate degree is in anthropology, but I'm a neuroscientist and I'm in psychology, I'm in marketing, and I'm leading an initiative in Wharton, right, of all places. So how do you get there? It's odd that you get there starting out where I did. So I grew up on the south side of Cleveland, more or less coming of age in the 1970s and 80s. Nobody in my family had ever gone to college. My dad was a mechanic and my mom drove a school bus. My mom's family was a family of grocers. So I wasn't thinking about college really. I was just kind of thinking, I liked school a lot. I really liked nature. I liked animals, so that informed a lot of what I did. I kept Time Life books under my bed, primates and human evolution, and I would read those every night. And I played a lot of sports, and so those were sort of my passions growing up. Art was a passion of mine. And in fact, of all the sciences, I really liked biology, but biology was so bad at my high school, I didn't take it. So I never took a biology course until into college. Believe it or not. So anyway, I was just growing up and doing the high school thing, and captain of the football team, was really into all of that kind of thing. I was actually, the time I was growing up, I don't know if you've ever seen the show Glee, right? So Glee is kind of like based on a program that we had at my high school that was sort of this pop singing, dancing group, and believe it or not, I was in this thing. So I was kind of like the guy Finn, so I was connecting the jocks and the artsy people. And if there's sort of one kind of aspect of my personality that developed at that time that has carried through to inform the way I do things now, is that I mixed with many, many different groups, in high school. I was always, I was with the jocks, but I was with the artsy people, I was with all the nerds, I was, So that was, I didn't know that was foundational, but I was not in a silo at that time, and I think that's, an important feature of what I do now, which is to try to get everybody out of those silos and to be able to talk with people from different disciplines and to have that respectful curiosity. And so if I'm just kind of riffing right now, thinking back in time, that was something that I was developing and didn't realize it. And that I think is really important for whatever success I've had since. And certainly great for having fun at a university because it allows you to interact with so many cool people. So I miraculously, I did well in school, and I had a sports angle, and so I actually I was getting recruited to colleges, which was a weird thing, and applied to and got into a number of Ivy League schools, and that was kind of a shock to me, but was great. And I went to Yale, and I don't know why. I just did. It's actually I don't know now whether this is apocryphal in my own memory or whether, I think it's true. I know the event is true, I just don't know whether I gamed it, but it was like the last day where you have to send in your college acceptance. And I had actually signed all of them, and I had not made a decision, and my friends were like, where are you going to go? You've got to go to, Yale, you got to go do this. I'm like, I don't know. And I put them behind my back and tore up some, and I had one, and that was where I went. So it was like, so it was kind of fun. When I went to Yale, and I was supposed to play football, but it was determined right away that I'd had way too many concussions, and that was right when awareness was growing about that. So I stopped playing, and that was good. I'm glad that I did that, although I've suffered a few concussions since then. But anyway, that was really eye-opening because suddenly I had all this time, and it opened my mind to, I was like, what do I want to do? And you look at the Yale course catalog and I go, wow, look at all these classes. This is amazing. This is not like high school where you have math and science and English, and that's about it, right? So I started sampling lots and lots of things, and discovered anthropology, really liked it. And then the thing about anthropology, excuse me, is that it's of all the disciplines, it's sort of the broadest, and that's what was so appealing to me because it's a science, it's got biology, but it's social science, and it's really got humanities too. And so it allowed me to kind of do all those things that I really loved. So I bounced around within anthropology when I did my degree. Eventually, when I was between junior and senior year, I went on a NSF-sponsored field summer research program, and that was in Mexico. And so I was studying primates in the field, and that was an amazing, intense experience. I also met my future wife on that trip, who many of you know, Dr. Elizabeth Brannon, who's here. So we've been together since that time, and then by the time senior year was kind of halfway through, I had to decide what I was going to do with my life, or at least the next part of my life. All of my friends were going. That was like the time when everybody went into investment banking. All my friends were going to Goldman and whatever, and I was like, oh my God, this sounds horrible.
I think they still do that now.
Do they?
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny now. I'm saying, now I work with a lot of people who are investment bankers or former investment bankers, and I find a lot of what they do really interesting. But at that time, I thought that does not sound like a life for me. And in fact, I didn't want to work at all. I had no desire to have a job at that point. So I thought, what can I do that doesn't mean having a job? And people say, you could go to graduate school. I was like, oh, graduate school. That sounds great, because I love school. And so, seriously. So I applied to a bunch of graduate programs in anthropology, and Liz also applied to, she was applying to do? Transfer, I guess, because she was on my first year student at Brown. And in any event, we ended up here at Penn, so I came to the PhD program here at Penn in anthropology. So I was in the museum, the amazing place down the road. That's where all my courses were held, and that was awesome. But it was also, it was awesome, but it was very different probably from what, if any of you are graduate students who have gone to graduate school, it's very different because that was like a super intensive, course-intensive program. So we had to take 20 classes before you could even like start on, your research. It was like shocked. You had to do you had to have foreign language proficiency requirement. So you had to be able to translate articles or books from some language, right? So it was like probably very different from if any of you are in psychology or neuroscience or analytics or anything like that. So I spent all my time taking courses, but that was also pretty great. So I was taking anthropology courses, psychology courses here, biology, botany, you name it, all kinds of things that I was trying to round out the capability to kind of do ethology, field primate behavior, but also bring in psychology as well. So this was sort of a really hot time here at Penn in the, early 1990s, late 80s, early 1990s. That psychology department here was, it's strong now, but it was like really, like there were some really incredible people here at that time, and I met my mentors who would shape a lot of my intellectual thinking in life, Dorothy Cheney and Robert Seyfarth, and so that kind of pulled me into the psychology department quite a bit. And I toyed with actually switching from anthropology to psychology, but then I just decided, I put all this effort in, I'm just going to finish up as quickly as possible and move on to do a postdoc. So while I was a graduate student, I got turned on to Randy Gallistel's work, and I read his book, The Organization of Learning, which I recommend still to anybody here. It's an amazing book that kind of combines ethology, natural history, evolutionary biology, psychology, and neuroscience, and it made it so vivid and real to me, and also opened my eyes to the possibility of trying to investigate the mechanisms that are underlying behavior and cognition and our mental faculties, and doing so in a really rigorous way. So that was kind of the thing that really put me on the path to neuroscience. So I did my courses in 2.5 years, which was like the fastest that anybody had done it at that time. Spent a year doing research, and then I was just out of here. So I think I was out of here by the time I was 24, 25, which is, now when I think about it and I talk to my own PhD students and whatnot, that was like young. It didn't seem young then. I felt really old at that point. But when that moment came, Liz and I were deciding what we were going to do next and where we were going to go, and it was sort of like her turn to kind of lead the decision-making process, and she decided to go to Columbia for graduate school, and so that was good for me because at least narrowed the search space in terms of, well, where do I need to find something? But I didn't know exactly what. And so when it came down to it, I had sort of 3 options on my plate. It's like one was doing more primate kind of comparative psychology work in Carol Schwartz's lab. The second was going to Rockefeller and retooling completely and becoming a bird biologist, neurobiologist. So I was going to work with Fernando Notenbaum, kind of splitting my time between New York City and the field station in upstate New York, and really learn the ins and outs of histology and in situ hybridization and doing all this stuff, but to combine that with field experiments and things like that. And it was super appealing to me. But it was kind of hard for me to give up the working on primates, especially because I had, it was like the reason I worked on primates is because of the lens it gave me on human nature. And at that time, Paul Glimcher, who would become my postdoctoral mentor, had just started a faculty position at NYU. And he had been a graduate student here with Randy Gallistel and knew my advisors very well. And so Robert and Dorothy connected me to Paul and said, maybe you should go visit Paul's lab and see what, if anything, maybe something could happen there. So I went to visit Paul's lab, and I was like, this is not for me. This is like, I can't imagine myself doing this. This is way too hard. And I don't see it all. At that time, Paul was studying eye movements, which is sort of, everybody was studying eye movements at that time. It was because eye movements are a really nice motor system to study, and that means you can start to chip away at the things that inform those processes. But I thought, I don't want to study eye movements. It's so boring. And Paul said, well, if you put in the time and the hard work for a couple of years, then you'll be in a position to start answering all those really interesting questions that you have. And we'd cooked up this whole plan where I was going to study face perception and all this stuff. I thought, okay, well, maybe I can do that. And so I joined Paul's lab. I also took the graduate curriculum in neuroscience because I knew nothing about neuroscience. So I was doing that. I joined Paul's lab. I was the first postdoc in his lab. He had one graduate student. We were building the lab. So let's just say, in retrospect, it was an awesome opportunity to learn how to build something from the ground up and how to circumvent certain things in terms of, like, if you need something done and the phone lines don't work, wiring your own phone lines, or putting in your own ground after work sunk through the elevator shaft into the basement because engineering won't do it for you. So I learned a lot during that time, but it was incredibly challenging, and many times I thought I was just going to quit. But in the end, we were able to do some interesting things. I did publish some really boring eye movement papers. That was I kind of felt like that was I don't know what you call that. That's like this sort of credential, like you stamped your. It's like you did this really boring hard thing, and see, I can do that. It's like a boot camp kind of thing. But then, that was a time period when people were starting to talk about decision making in neuroscience, but the decisions that they were talking about were decisions about, like, is the light bright or dim, the dots going left or right, and that's an interesting perceptual decision. But I was coming from this other perspective and thinking, well, in these other fields like economics or psychology, decision making is so much more, right? And there's a whole formal field for how to conceptualize and operationalize the factors that shape decisions. Why don't we just do that? Because I was naive enough to think, well, why don't we just, and what I actually proposed, why don't we just study the marginal value theorem from ecology? It's super easy. We'll do. So we did that. It was so funny now when I think back on it, because the way that I did those experiments, in which I was manipulating the value of two options that a monkey was choosing between while we were monitoring what was happening in his brain, and we didn't even have the capability to vary those things in software. So I had to do this in hardware. Like, I put in these little trim pots on the solenoid controlling valves, and every time I'd switch blocks, I had to dial up different amounts of juice really fast, in the intertrial interval, because that was the only, we had to literally solve these problems in hardware. It was like really funny to think back on. But anyway, that ended up being, so it ended up being a Nature paper in 1999, which was like, and it's a foundational paper in neuroeconomics. And looking back, it's like, oh, that's amazing. What an amazing time that was. Yeah, it was a time when we couldn't get a single grant to support any of that work. So if you've ever, when you're trying to push the envelope and when you're doing something that's very new that doesn't quite fit into what the current zeitgeist is, it's often very, very challenging, right, to support it. And so we had to find other ways to support the work. But it also was one of those, I think, experiences that I keep having, which has inspired one of my mottos, for the lab, which is faith-based neuroscience. So you got to have faith in what you're doing, and if you if you believe in it, eventually you'll find a way to make it work. And if it's an interesting idea and the behavior is interesting, there's always going to be something interesting going on in the brain, and so that's sort of start with behavior. So at that point, Liz was winding up her graduate studies, and so we were thinking about next steps, kind of. I was not really ready to get on the job market again. Remember, I never wanted to have a job. I just wanted to stay in school for as long as possible. And Paul had gone to, I think it was a McKnight meeting or something. I think it was in Aspen, and so he was talking about our work. And Larry Katz was there, the late Larry Katz, who was a friend and mentor, but he was at Duke University, and he's this incredible polymath, genius neuroscientist. And he was really excited about what we were doing, and so they had a job search. They had been trying to fill this assistant professor in cognitive neuroscience, which was a very new thing back then. And they called me up and they said, "We would like you to come down and give a talk and apply for this job." And I'm like, "But I'm not on the market. I don't want to, don't want to have a job yet." But anyway, I did. I went down and gave a talk in the neurobiology department, and they said, "Well, we'd like to make you an offer." Well, then we started thinking, well, maybe we should apply to other places to see, if maybe that there's more appeal. There wasn't, so I didn't get any other job offers. But Duke was great. I mean, Duke was awesome, and not only did they make me a job offer, but they made Liz a job offer, which then made it like, well, you can't turn that down. So we moved down there, and then I started my assistant professor job in the Department of Neurobiology, which was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. And it's one of those things where you hit the ground and you hear from everybody, like your tenure clock has started, and I'm thinking, and traditionally primate neurophysiology labs are super slow to get started, and so I'm like just going as fast as I can, building everything myself. Taking any warm-bodied graduate student at the time who would like set foot in the lab and say, come on, and like, yeah, you can do whatever you want. Just help me put this stuff together. And I was, really terrified of the other faculty, so I used to not go to faculty meetings. I don't think I went to a single faculty meeting for like 3 years. But I think they thought I was just like, oh, he's so dedicated. He's in the lab all the time. He doesn't care about politics, So it was pretty, it was a good game I was running then.
Was it the politics that you wanted to avoid, or was it like, what were you scared of?
I have no idea, everything. Yeah, it doesn't look like it now. I was a super high anxiety person, and I felt, and that sort of, imposter syndrome, like, what the heck am I doing here? And how am I in a neurobiology department in a medical school? So I don't have a degree in this stuff. I barely know neuroscience, and now I'm in the Department of Neurobiology. I'm expected to teach not only graduate students, but medical students. What, God forbid, they make a mistake because of something I taught them, So I was very overwhelmed. But I had wonderful mentors there on, the research side, the teaching side, who kind of really took me under their wing and began to help me think about how to teach medical students in general. So, and at the time, there was this new Center for Cognitive Neuroscience as well, which I was a part of, which was also critical for my intellectual life and for kind of my career path, because the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience was a umbrella, kind of university-spanning center where people were appointed in different departments, mostly not in the School of Medicine, mostly in arts and sciences and engineering and whatnot. And so that was really, a fantastic thing for me. And I don't know how much longer, how much should I continue talking about this? But I was, that was the place where I really, that was my career for 15 years, was being at Duke. There are some funny moments, like, that I look back on are really, really meaningful to me. Like, when I came up for 30 review and my meeting with my chair, and he said two things, which is, you need to focus, because I was like doing all these different things, and I think you should work on mice, and because of all the tools that are available. And I seriously considered it. I was like, maybe I should work on mice. But so we actually started doing some experiments with mice, and then after a while, I said, I don't understand mice at all. I have no feeling for this organism. So I abandoned that, and I just kind of doubled down on what we were doing. And at that time, what I was pursuing in the lab was continuing the work in decision making, and then extending our work into social behavior, which was really what my passion was going back. That was kind of what I originally proposed to do in Paul's lab and never got around to doing it. And, he was right. I had acquired a lot of the tools that would be, instrumental in allowing me to begin trying to make this squishy thing something that you could tame for the lab and use, modern technologies to begin understanding the mechanisms. And so, while I was there, now it's going to start sounding linear. It's like, and then I got tenure, which was great. But it's certainly better than not getting tenure, I think. But, the funny thing is about getting tenure, there's a lot of funny things about it. But the bad part about getting tenure is like the day after, and I'm walking in and I'm about to go into my office, and my good friend Rich Mooney's going into his office next door. We're going in, and I had this sort of flash forward like 30 years, and we're like all old and doing the exact same thing. And I thought, oh my God, this is going to be over before I know it. So that's when I really started trying to think about and develop this this real habit for trying to do different things and get involved in other kinds of things. And so I started collaborating more with people doing human work, brain imaging work, whatnot. I started a center with Scott Hutel's Center for Neuroeconomics at Duke, which was one of the first. I ended up moving over physically to the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience to kind of get some fresh perspective on things. I ended up running the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience as its director for, I don't know how long, six years maybe. And in that process, just continue to keep kind of moving around and trying to do new things, right? Eventually kind of was starting to do a lot of administrative and leadership positions, and eventually was the director of the Institute for Brain Sciences for 4 or 5 years at Duke before I left. And that was a really awesome, fun, challenging gig. I mean, it was a startup when the founding director, David Fitzpatrick, had left to go to the Max Planck Institute. And Zab Johnson, who is now here as executive director of Wharton Neuroscience, she was the associate director, and Zab and I had known each other since she was a graduate student at NYU and I was a postdoc, so there's a whole history there. That was such a fun position because the role was all about connecting neuroscientists across campus, so in school of medicine, psychology, engineering, whatnot, but then connecting neuroscience to other disciplines and schools, so business, law, humanities, arts, and so that meant, here I am in high school again, right? I'm going and talking to these folks and trying to develop dialogues and help speak their, try to learn their languages and help translate that back to people in neuroscience and find ways to get people working together. And we started a bunch of centers within the institute. We had we developed an undergraduate major in neuroscience, which ended up having hundreds of students in it. I started a boot camp for graduate students in neuroscience across all of the disciplines, so they could all come together and learn for 2 weeks and create a sense of community amongst them because they would all go back off to their respective programs. So I learned all of the tricks of the trade for running something like this, which is building the educational mission out, supporting research, but especially building communities. So getting people together, finding ways to get them to talk, to learn from each other, to work together, and then also engaging with outside communities. So that meant, at Duke, that meant engaging with alumni and friends and partners at the university. We created a board for the institute, which is a really fun thing to get to know people who are not in academics, who are out in the world, and find what animates them, to learn how to actually pitch neuroscience or pitch anything really, because somebody who's not an academic and who's got an attention span of 30 seconds, you've got to be able to deliver in that, So that was an important lesson. So then, I'm going along again, being bored, not bored, but not wanting to get stuck in suddenly being old and life passed me by, having this real fear of mortality, I guess. So looking at other opportunities, which most of the ones that were coming in were administrative, so interviewing for dean and provost positions, which sounded interesting, but I also thought, I'm not dead yet. I've got a lot more life left in the lab, I'm 45 years old, and my lab was doing really creative work. I felt like I wasn't spending enough time in the lab. And then this opportunity at Penn came around, which was kind of shocking. It was like, come to Penn and you can have 2 appointments. And you'll be equally appointed, and the idea here is for you to be a bridge between a couple of disciplines, and we'll give you resources and whatnot. I said, this sounds really cool, but I want 3 appointments. They said, really? Nobody's ever. Most people are a little overwhelmed with 1. You really want 3? Because, and it's true, 3 times the faculty meetings is quite a lot. But remember, I didn't go to faculty meetings when I was assistant professor. So, but it was really important to me to, psychology was critical in this, in my thinking about this, because between neuroscience and business, you need kind of that intervening step in an intellectual home. And so, here I am now in this incredible thing, and where I've got a big basic science lab. We have clinically oriented research, but bizarrely, we're doing exactly what I pitched to the deans and the president here, which, and Amy was so amazing when I was getting the offer. She just called me up. She said, "This is your lucky day. I want to give you the opportunity to build your dream job." It's like, really? Okay, what would my dream job be? And so the dream job involved doing what I was doing, but kind of on steroids, really reinventing my research program. But the important thing for me was to try to do something really new and disruptive and have an impact. So, one of the things about basic science is you often feel like, your whole goal is to publish papers and get your students jobs, which is an important thing to do, but it's hard to measure the impact, and it's slow. The clinically facing stuff, let's face it, most things fail. If you do get something positive, it's very incremental. But the opportunity to be here in this amazing business school with so much talent, so many connections around the world, so much visibility, meant we can do something that's highly visible. People are going to pay attention. They're going to take notice. This is entirely new opportunity, and it's very entrepreneurial in spirit at Wharton. And so, I think that they'll be game, right? I think they'll be willing to give it a go. And and I think that what they were thinking is he's going to build a center for neuroeconomics. And I said, well, that's so 10 years ago. Let me see what Wharton's all about first. And so I kind of pondered while I was here for about 6 months. I said, I think this can be much bigger than that. So that's where the idea for Wharton Neuroscience came from, because I thought we can have an impact not just on finance and economics, which we certainly are, but and clearly marketing, brand strategy, but management. Think about all of the ways in which an understanding of human nature can help us to understand employees better, right? How we can do team dynamics and leadership better, all those different things, and entrepreneurship, blah blah blah. There's just and this is just exploding, but I couldn't do that alone. That's like a really heavy lift. So I recruited Sam Johnson here, who is my partner back at Duke, and so she's been here for the last couple of years helping with that effort, and and it's actually happening. It's amazing. So we have a curriculum in neuroscience, applied neuroscience for business. We have a minor and major for MBAs in development. We we have a thriving research program. We have corporate engagement. So we have companies who are coming in and partnering with us to provide opportunities for us and for students to get engaged with them. It's incredible, and the student response has been fantastic. There's almost 500 students in our student club at this point, which is incredible. It's sort of doubled every year in the last 3 years. So Yeah, it was all, like I said, it was all linear. This is exactly what I wanted to do when I was 8 years old. Yeah, that's kind of silly, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really cool. I was just wondering, like a recurring theme in your story was that you wanted to do like it's totally linear. We could see that,
Yeah.
but in the way that it was, a kind of a start and stop in different directions and trying to do different things, you still had this kind of core, like, these are the types of things that I would like to do, and yet you were not able to do them immediately. You had to go through the research and all of these different things and start and stop, and then eventually you were able to do things that you were able to do, that you've been wanting to do, and more. What kept you going in that direction? Were you following a kind of dream, or was there I'm just wondering what kept you going in this kind of direction?
I don't know. I did not have a dream. I did not really, all I knew was that I didn't want to do anything that wasn't interesting to me, right? And so that, if there's one thing that was really a focus, was pushing as hard as I could push to do things that were interesting. And I never wanted to do anything incremental. I wanted to do things that were big, right? So, and I don't know where that comes from, but it's just, the idea of kind of tying up that last 1% of variance in our understanding of X, Y, or Z just didn't really appeal to me. Maybe there's stubbornness. I think some of that, when I think about it, it goes back to sports, honestly. And it's odd now that I'm doing a lot of work in sports performance here with Penn Athletics and with professional sports teams. But growing up playing football is pretty rough. And if you've ever seen the movie Nixon, which I highly recommend, especially right now, sort of biopic. Who did that? I can't remember who did that. Anyway, there's this scene in the very beginning where he was a lineman, playing football, and I can't remember which college out in California, and they just keep knocking him down in the mud, and they keep saying, "Get up, Nixon! Get up, Nixon!" And I felt like that's what sports is all about. Just get up. It doesn't matter. Just keep going on. And so that was kind of the way a lot of science was for me. Like every time there was a failure, it was like I'm just going to keep going forward because I can't. That's just had been, just beaten into me that I was not going to give up in the face of anything like that. So I think that's actually really critical to have. It's because it's really hard, right? It's really, really hard. And I was told going into it, it's like, okay, 90% of your experiments will fail, and this, that, and the other thing, and you've got to just be ready to push on through that. And so that is, you have to have kind of really thick skin, and that's true as you go further on too. And I think this is and I see it in my own trainees so much now. It's like when they get paper reviews back, or grant reviews, and they're just crushed, and it's like, yeah, it's horrible. I mean, it doesn't matter how old you are, and how experienced, but you kind of just got to go, you know what? You get up, just don't stop. Just keep pushing right through it. You can't be weighed down by it. There's a question up there.
You said that since you've started your career as in anthropology, and then when you first moved into Duke, and you were in the Department of Neurobiology with all these medicine people.
Yeah.
So you mentioned imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Did you have a specific moment at which you were like that kind of gone away, and you realized that you really had a really good foundation of neurobiology, and you were confident about tackling all these sort of stuff?
I still have imposter syndrome. I mean, and it's bound for me to happen because I keep trying to do join all these other fields, which is kind of silly. But no, I think over time you learn, and once you actually start getting grants and publishing, you start to feel like, oh yeah, I kind of, maybe I can do this. I think teaching was really important. And I was really, when I first started out in this field, I was the worst speaker. My very first talk in neurobiology, I practically fainted when I got my first question, which was very challenging right in the middle of it. I had to sit down, and then Paul was saying, "Get up." And it's like, I can't. I have to sit down. I'm lightheaded. I'm going to pass out. But teaching is really good because if you want to master a subject, the best way to do that is to have to teach it. It's one thing to just study it and read it, but you don't really understand it until you have to convey it to somebody else. And I don't mean lecture it at them, but actually, convey it in a way that helps them to understand it. And so teaching medical students was a privilege, and it was a great experience. And I think that that helped a lot. And that helped a lot with grant writing, too, at least initially.
I have the privilege of having been to all these talks. And one thing that is kind of interesting is that actually Dave Meany also is a first-generation student, and also his path was through football.
Oh, really?
And so it seems kind of unusual, because on the one hand, I feel like this messaging we're giving to young, bright boys now is stay away.
Yeah.
But it feels like there's another confidence that comes with, with being an athlete that also sort of helps set you up in this way.
Yeah. I would agree with that completely. I mean, I think that, being an athlete, being involved in sports, they would say, you always hear it builds character, it builds discipline. And I think it's absolutely true, right? And it builds resilience. So, I've been getting up before the crack of dawn since the beginning of time, and I've been, hitting the gym first thing in the morning. That kind of discipline, I think, is, it sets you up for all the other kinds of things that you have to be able to do. I do think it's an interesting thing you point out, which is it's a way to have opportunity, for kids who don't come, who are first gen, who don't come from that kind of background, even if they do well in school. And so, so I have always had, a special place in my heart for high school and college athletics. And there was a time at Duke where there was, as sometimes happens, there was an event, a scandal involving athletics at the university, which created a huge row amongst the faculty. And there was a certain segment of the faculty who were like, we should get rid of athletics. We should, and that's like, that's exactly the wrong thing to do. I think it's super important to many of these students, right? It's a way for kids to get here. It's a source. It's an identity. It's a way to build community, right, and to build strength and character. So that's not what we need to do. We need to help athletic programs where they're having problems. But that's a really interesting thing that you're pointing out. Now I'm going to have to connect with Dave on football.
As a sort of a follow-up on that, I think from the first generation perspective, you talked, an emerging thing for me listening to you talk was the ability to hear advice, think about it, and then to just forge your own path and to just stick to what was true for you. And I think a lot of times the message that we hear around first generation students is they should limit their expectations and just try to survive, or that they should just focus on the one thing. At least my experience was very much like the lack of familial expectation freed me in so many ways. Like I wasn't constrained in many a way that I think, again, in retrospect, that my peers were.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I think there were sort of two things going on in my family. I think two dynamics. So my parents, with no expectation, so it was all gravy to them, it was all good. And they also just never understood what I was doing. It was just like, what's going on with you? But, the kind of my extended family are like, why are you still in school and why are you not a doctor yet? Why are you wasting your time on, all this other silly stuff? When I was a postdoc, they were like, when are you going to get a real job? And I'm like, well, I am getting paid something, not a lot. The other thing, though, that you brought up, this is another thing that I think goes into that sort of but it relates to that determination and just hard work. I mean, when I was in college, I worked 2 jobs too. So one job was as an aide to the master of the college. So that was sort of a glorified errand boy. And that was nice, but I started working in the dining hall sophomore year, and that was awesome. I loved working in dining hall. Dining hall work was unionized at Yale, and I was working with people from the community, and it was the highest paying job on campus too, and it was hard work, and I loved all of that, and it was free food. So it was like that was like yeah, it was like that was like the best thing ever. Yeah.
Oh,
She has a question.
Yeah.
So kind of going off the question previously, another Penn professor, Angela Duckworth, has studies on grit, how grit helps children kind of like pursue their goals independently from more immediate gratification. And do you think examples, there are other examples like that can connect developmental psychology with like kind of decision making, which is what you're interested in? Do you see that kind of research like on a growing trend, or like you've seen anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is growing interest in. So often what we do, unfortunately, in science is we study this captive population of college students, and so that's where our kind of foundational knowledge is. And so to kind of extend, to understand real people, we need to get outside of that bubble. And I think, developmental studies of decision making, there have been some. So there's actually really, really growing interest in that. That's something I'm really interested in, and so it's something we're starting to do here, and actually to work with my wife on that because that's her expertise. My perspective on it's a little bit different too, because since I spent a lot of my career, a lot of my time kind of trying to get inside the head of a nonverbal animal, whose brain is basically just a smaller version of our brain, wired up in more or less the same way, and our brains rely on a lot of the same computational processes and mechanisms that are in those critters. So the tasks that we develop for them to kind of explore how they think and how their brains work, when we give those to adult humans, it's really interesting because it sort of seems to expose and unveil a lot of these same kinds of processes that aren't available through traditional psychological means. And what I think that means to me is I can say, wow, these will be really great as assessment tools for kids who are starting out minimally verbal, right, and moving on up where it just does not require a lot of training or a lot of understanding or conveying of information. These are more like games, but we know a lot about the underlying biology, right? So I think so we're really excited about that possibility.
And I wanted to ask you a question. I'm a first generation student, and many questions have come up about first generation students. So you're definitely an inspiration. I was wondering, you had mentors in graduate school, even at the faculty level, postdoc level. Did you find mentors while you were in college and high school? Mainly college.
Yeah, well, in high school, my mentors were my coaches. Yeah, definitely. In college, so there was a particular professor in anthropology, a guy named Mark Burchett, and he was, I think, perhaps at the time, the only African American physical anthropologist at that time, or it was like, so he was like he was first gen also, and he just like was a really inspirational figure for me, and he was such a fantastic teacher who was so invested in students, right? And he was like the first professor I ever had who said, hey, I'm going to Toads later. Do you want to come hear music? And I was like, yeah, I can do that, That's very strange. So he was sort of one of my first mentors, and then when I was a senior, also my my senior thesis advisor, was a really fantastic mentor as well.
That's really great.
Yeah. So faculty can play a role, believe it or not, in the development of students. Yeah.
So Weiji Ma actually had an interesting kind of confession. He talked about his whole life he's had kind of an obsession with online chess, and it enables him to procrastinate. And he admitted that he still uses that to this day. And so he told a story of having to apply for a grant and needing to start on a Sunday, and then still sort of like at 3 a.m. still playing. So is there something that is there like a thing that you have to sort of, that you hate, like that you have to kind of overcome in order to be able to do your job still?
Well, nobody wants to start writing a grant.
So
it's the worst.
Is it online chess or?
Oh, what do I do?
Netflix?
Yeah, the things that actually, I think I understand some of the neurobiology of this, but the thing, when I have that kind of, I don't want to call it writer's block, but whatever, where it's hard to get started, the things that always kind of uncork thinking are, getting out, walking, running. I usually try to go for a long run, and while I'm running, it's sort of inchoate. You have this feeling something's going on, that things are happening in my head, but I won't sit down to start writing until I've probably done a lot of that. So it will be many days. And sometimes things come to me and I have to stop, and at least now I have an iPhone and I can kind of take down some notes before I forget it. But it's weird, but that'll all kind of happen, and then usually when I sit down in front of the computer, it's like it just comes right out. So even though I wouldn't have known it ahead of time. The other thing I'll say in that now that's happened really over the last 5 or 6 years is that I've kind of rediscovered that I'm a really visual thinker, and the way I kind of put together ideas is, when I search on Google, I use image search only. I don't search for text, and I kind of know what things look like, or what it's an interesting thing. Like, even to find articles, I know what the figure looks like, but I have no idea what the text is. So it's, I don't know, that's just a way that I now begin to build ideas and narratives, is just from the visual pieces themselves. That was another question that
You mentioned you know a little bit about the neuroscience behind. Would you just describe like the kind of, when you put aside what you should work on, and then?
Well, I mean, yeah. So I don't think that we know. It's a lot of circumstantial connection of dots.
So subconscious or the unconscious to me.
A little. I mean, I think what we're talking about is this. So this default mode network, which horrible terminology, but we know it's this network in the brain that kind of comes online when you're not doing some routine task where you're focused, like sitting in front of an Excel spreadsheet. It's like the worst thing. If you want to have this thing turned on, having that thing turned on is associated with a lot of processes related to introspection, exploration, thinking about the future, creativity, blah, 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 blah. We know that from behavioral and psychophysical studies that, stepping back, getting up, walking, whatever, getting out, has an impact on those kinds of processes. Now, default mode network function hasn't been measured while people are out walking around or doing things like that, but it's a reasonable hypothesis and connection to make. It's something that we, hope to be able to at least measure indirectly at some point.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And one last question.
Then it's party time.
And then it's party time. So you've basically made it. Do you have
I don't know if my mother agrees with that. She's like, what do you do again?
So if you were to go back and you were to talk to little you, you were doing all sorts of things in high school, art, sports, talking with different people in different spaces. Like, what would you encourage yourself to do, knowing where you are now?
What do you mean by do? You mean to kind of get here faster, or?
It could be keep doing what you're doing. It could be.
I wouldn't, look. I've seen Back to the Future. I mean, I don't want to whatever. If I screw up one little thing, like the whole future could be different, and that, no. I mean, that's a little bit facetious, but it's. I think I try to really. Tell myself that everything was going to be all right, because I spent a lot of time, honestly, crying, just where things were just miserable, or they just seemed like, nothing is going to work, or I have no idea what I'm going to do with my life, or, there were many stressful periods like that in college, at the beginning of graduate school, coming up with a thesis topic, I was having a heart attack. I mean, there were so many. Literally. There were times where I was seeing a cardiologist as a young postdoc, because I was having heart palpitations, which it turned out was just all stress generated internally, my own stress, when things were fine. It was just trying to, thinking I needed to do a lot more than I was doing. And, now I'm relatively chill, but it's there's a lot of grief that I had to go through, and I'd been to therapy and done other things, and it's hard to get that from somebody else, you know what I mean? So if I could talk to me, maybe I could really convince me, you know what I mean?
That's great. All right, well, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for having me.